kind of fascinating in a sense to talk about Kentucky is I think we all know that the buyout is way too much for them to do anything right now. So they're in essence stuck with him. I'm not saying that in a bad way or a good way, because I like Mark Stoops. I think for people outside of Lexington, I don't think a lot of people realize like how much he's really done, especially, for people who've gone back even with, the Joker Phillips era, people who remember that. And then you think of Mark Stoops and you realize it's not that bad. Right. But nevertheless, I guess one of my big storylines for this year is I'm just curious about how much is Mark Stoops going to let their coordinators do their thing versus how hands-on he's going to be. And I mean that in the sense that we talked about this a couple of seconds ago, and I think it will be good to elaborate on it because of some of the players that they're bringing in. But from previous experience, Bush Hamden, he wants to spread the football around. He wants the aerial attack, whereas Mark Stoops, historically speaking, as you mentioned before with Benny Snell, have primarily been rushing teams. So with that said, based off the guys that you see him bring in, such as Zach Calzada, who had a stint at Texas A&M and Auburn, you have Dante Dowdell, transfer from Nebraska. How do you see those guys evolving with Hamden's offense, and what changes do you think you're going to see from last year to this year?
See, that, like I said, that's kind of the $1 million question right now. What they're going to do? I think as I said, Cozart, he has some SEC experience, but I think a lot of it starts with the offensive line. They went out and made great strides trying to improve that position this year, both through the portal and through recruiting. And you also have to take into account that Kentucky's top two receivers from last year are gone. Dane Key transferred to Nebraska, and Barryon Brown is now at LSU. Yeah. So, you have Jamori Macklin coming back. A guy that I'm really high on, Kendrick Law, Alabama transfer. Everybody. Let's see, how can I put this? Almost everybody in the Big Blue Nation wants them to open up the playbook. Throw the ball. You think about it. You go back through history. The air raid was really kind of created here, with or at least perfected with Mike Leach, and when he was on Hal Mummy's staff. And there is a majority. I won't say a majority. There's a lot of people in this fan base who think that's the only way you can be successful. Playing football. Open it up, throw, then run the ball when you have to. But as we know, that's not Stoops's. As someone once said, he's more like a Big Ten coach. Coaching in the SEC with the insistence on running. But you can't argue with for the results for the most part by doing that. But back to your original point, I think I think he's got to let more freedom this year. I can't speak for him, of course, but I think he has to realize at this point, okay, what we've been doing the last couple of years is not working. We need to open up the playbook. There's been talk, Stoops is, still has the final say with everything, with the play calling and everything else, and the coordinators are just coordinators in name only. But I think he has to let that open up the playbook this year, and if for no other reason, just try to bring some excitement to the program, because right now the excitement, the excitement meter is it's not quite on E, but it's not it's not very there's not a whole lot of excitement in the program. As you said, Dowdell, the Nebraska transfer, he had a great season for Nebraska last year. Almost you could say not totally, but traded Dane Key for him, kind of thing, because he went there and then he came here, and then Kentucky has some really good running backs. Jamarian Wilcox was Kentucky's leading rusher last year. But the interesting thing was in the spring he was third on the depth chart. So, but another guy I'm really high on is Jason Patterson. He was kind of running as the second string running back in spring practice. Sorry, I lost the picture for a second there. He was running. They've got some good backs. Like I said, it's just a matter. It's just like I said. I think it's just a matter of getting a. They've got to open up the playbook. They've got to try to do anything they can to bring some excitement this year. And then they just announced just a slightly different topic. They just announced in the past week they're going to do all these renovations to Kroger Field. Help the game day experience. They're talking about putting in a like a place where you can go, like a party atmosphere, like before the game, like you kind of see with a lot of pro sports teams where there's these bars and restaurants.
Tailgate set up in essence, yeah.
Yeah, they're going to try to do stuff like that to try to bring back some excitement to the team. And right at this point, I think Kentucky needs anything that won't be starting until next year. But you think about season ticket sales are down, I think like 12% or something from the year before, and a lot of people are just it's kind of the wait and see approach. If we'll see how things start, and if things are going better, then we'll get our tickets and we'll come watch, kind of thing. So, but I think to answer your question, he's got to open up the playbook more, let Hampton do his thing. When he was at Boise State, did some great things with the offense there. He was at Missouri when they had, great offenses. There's been, all these, it is weird. All these guys have been a part of these great offenses, but then when they come here, it's kind of, I don't want to use the word meh, but it's kind of, it's not been, you've not seen the same results as you've seen at other schools. And so.
Exactly. Because, even when I look back last year and I kind of think about, some of those games, obviously I go back and think of the Georgia game, even though like that was hard to watch just because there wasn't much offense whatsoever. Right. But it just kind of made me just think about in the sense that it seemed like no matter what was going on, like Brock Vandergrift, to me, at least his best attribute was him as a runner. Mm-hmm. So it just seems like they were almost trying to force something there. Whereas now, it's just going to be one of those things where we're going to have to wait and see, right? Because they do play a couple MAC teams at the beginning of the year. But I think this first matchup against Ole Miss is probably going to be what's really going to be kind of telling in terms of, exactly what you brought up, exactly how much risk are they going to take? How much are they going to open up the playbook versus are we going to get the same conservative, grind, control the clock, and hope that your defensive line and your secondary carries your team to, 6-7 wins in a bowl game and you walk off of the sunset and that's it.
Right. And the thing about it is, in that Ole Miss game, Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin and those guys are going to be fired up because that was obviously Kentucky's high point of the season last year was going down to Oxford and beating them. When that happened last year, we were like, oh, wow, we're going to be, this is going to be a great season because then, let's be honest, they had Georgia on the ropes, probably should have won that game. Everybody talks about the fourth down play. And yes, that was not the greatest play, but I still maintain that they lost it on second and third down.
That's what I
think. That they should have, there was different plays that could have been called. So you weren't in that fourth and long or fourth and whatever it was. And so again, it goes back to the, was that Stoops making those decisions or was it, or was it Hampton? But let's, I have to play just for a second. The Toledo game is not going to be an easy one because they're a lot of people's team picked to win the MAC, I think, this year. And you also have the interesting dynamic of Chip Trainum, who transferred from Ohio State to UK last year, was injured and didn't play that much. He transferred, checks notes. Oh, he's playing in Toledo. So, so you got that right out of the bat. But, I think with some luck, they have to have a lot of luck and a lot of breaks. 6 wins, it could be possible, but they'd have to get every break that, UK hasn't gotten in the last 2 years. I think this year, just because of the ridiculousness of the schedule. Like I said, you got, they play Texas and Tennessee, and they had won 3 straight against Florida, which had never hadn't happened since the 1950s. But now Florida appears to have gotten themselves right, and there are a lot of people a sleeper team for the playoff. And then the same with South Carolina. Kentucky had pretty much owned them for the better part of the last 8 years, but now Beamer has got those guys. They've lost 2 in a row to Kentucky, or they've lost 2 in a row to South Carolina. So these games, and even Vanderbilt, Kentucky was beating Vanderbilt handily, but now I think they've lost 2 out of the last 3 to Vandy. So those games that you kind of considered every year, okay, hey, we can win this game. We can beat South Carolina. They can beat Vandy. Like last year, they should have beat Auburn up here. That's 3 games. 3 games. Flip right there. You're going from 4-8 to 7-5. So and with the SEC schedule, you're playing everybody that you played last year. Just you're just swapping it. So I like to talk about. I've talked about the fact that Texas has been in the league 2 years, and they're coming to Kentucky this year. And Texas A&M has been in the league since 2012, and Kentucky's only played them once. That was like 8 years ago, and they still never come to Lexington. But maybe in the future schedule that'll be something something that happens. But yeah, like I said, the schedule not doing them any favors. And then Louisville, they won 5 straight against Louisville until last year's debacle there in the last game of the season in the Governor's Cup. So all of these games that Kentucky was winning, it's flipped the other side now. Now he's got it. Stoops and the staff's got to figure out a way to flip it back, to where Kentucky's winning again.
Yeah, I mean, what you bring up a good point too, because I mean, obviously I think we're being ambitious, even just throwing 5 or 6 out there right now. But at the same time, too, if Kentucky, I feel like it's one of those things where we all just kind of have to be along for the ride for it, because I think we'd all agree that paying him that much money is kind of crazy, but also in the sense too that, if you go back and really look at his records, I mean, his last losing records are back in 2020 and then 2015, if you don't count that vacated season from 2021 right, where they used some eligible players. So I guess if you're just looking at it on paper, it might not be as bad as people think, but also, after 13, 14 seasons, you kind of sit there and say to yourself, hey, is this the peak of what we're going to have, and we're just kind of on the decline? Or are we going to kind of have some of that Kentucky magic that we've seen over the past couple of years, which makes me think about the defense now, because that's obviously been their strength, their bread and butter, and quite frankly, what's kept them in contention a lot of these games that we talked about before. I think, particularly if we talk about in the lens of the SEC, I think Kentucky's defensive line, particularly last year, is probably one of the most underrated groups probably in all of the SEC, in my opinion. They got bullied around a little bit in some of the bigger games, but if you go back and watch the games where they were really in contention, that defensive line hung in really tough too. And also the secondaries in particular, Mark Stoops, Brad White, and this defensive staff have always done a really good job at developing a lot of these younger players too. So with that said, as you kind of look at some of these new transfers that are coming in, and you're looking at this group overall, where are some of the highlights that you see, and where are some of the question marks that you're going to have?
I think the biggest, I think the Kentucky's probably, Kentucky's probably the strongest in the secondary. They've as we've seen over the last couple of years, or the last few years, Kentucky has done a great job with the secondary and getting people to the NFL. Look at Maxwell Hairston this year. With Buffalo. Like I said, I think the secondary is probably probably one of the strengths. Just throwing out a couple of names. Jordan Lovett, the senior free safety. He's been a really, really good player. Ty Bryant at the other safety position. He's a Lexington native. Both of those guys, have done done some really good things over the years. Alex Safari, he can play about anywhere on the field, kind of that hybrid position that Josh Allen made famous a few years ago. I think the secondary is probably the strongest, and The linebackers, they lost about everybody, from last year. Dumas Johnson, like that. So, but they brought in a couple guys. Sam Green, I think could be a really good player for them. Just like I said, Alex Safari playing one of that linebacker kind of hybrid position, and then Daverine Rayner, he's a redshirt senior. Those three guys, they're going to have to get some big, big minutes and big, production out of them. But up front, David Gusta, who came in as a transfer, I think he's got potential. Was Kentucky's top ranked player in the portal. He had a big came from the trying to think of the
I think it was North Dakota State, because Humphrey Grace was another kid from the Midwest, and
right, yeah,
so, big guy,
but both of those guys, I think, could come in right there. Of course, trying to replace Deion Walker, literally and physically, is a huge task. And you're talking about how good, for the most part, the line played last year. We found out, we knew that Walker was hurt, but then we found out that he, was basically playing with like a broken bone in his back, all of last year. And it's like, I can't even, my back, sometimes I can't even get up in the morning. I can't imagine, getting out and playing and trying to play SEC caliber football. But just those guys, I think the secondary, like I said, I'm a little worried about the linebackers, but they have the talent. It's a lot of guys that have been with the program for 2 and 3 years, and it's time. It's kind of that point now where those guys have to step up, and if they do, I think, as you said, I think the defense can possibly keep Kentucky in a lot of games this year. But that's just kind of looking at a perceived depth chart. Those are some of the guys that, just off the top of my head, I would say, to look for in this 2025 season.
Yeah, because especially too, at least offensively speaking, I mean, they didn't have a running back that rushed for more than 600 yards last year, and they also didn't have a receiver who had more than 400 yards last year. So it just kind of makes me think to myself, hey, we're not necessarily expecting Kentucky to have 7-8 wins or anything, but if we can at least see some improvement on the offense, particularly if we can get that offensive line together, get that aerial attack, and get some more chances, and you keep developing what's going on the defensive side, and they're not sitting there having to be on the field for 3/4 of the game, they could turn some heads in terms of, maybe not necessarily pulling off upsets like Ole Miss every week like they did last year, but maybe they're being competitive, and some of the fans are showing up, and then they kind of say to themselves, hey, does Mark Stoops get annoyed? Do people get annoyed with Mark Stoops every once in a while? Yeah, I'm sure everyone has their gripes with him. But when you think about it, he probably is the best guy for the situation that they're in right now, especially just the experience and the caliber, and just understand, and just obviously, I think instilling just the culture that they have too is something that I think gets overlooked a lot.
Yeah, no, I think, for whatever complaints or criticisms we might have, like I said, Stoops has obviously taken this program to heights it has not seen. And, I think he deserves, at least another year. See what happens this year. I think the buyout is maybe like $35 million, maybe after this year. If they go 2-10 or something like that, then I think it's pretty, I think the writing will be on the wall. You got to, make a move. And I think the Big Blue Nation is kind of unified, that the guy, if it happens, or when Stoops retires, John Summerall is the guy that everyone seems to be in agreement, that they want. A former Cat, and is doing great things at Tulane right now. I mean, he seems pretty happy right now at Tulane, and honestly, it's probably easier. No offense to the American Conference, but it's probably a whole lot easier recruiting and playing there than it is, trying to fight with the Tennessees and the Texases and the, the Alabamas of the world. So, but that's number one on everybody's. He's probably like 1, 2, and 3 on everybody's wish list. And then, I think if something did happen, you have to have the situation where you have to make him say no. Like I said, we're getting way in front of, way ahead of things. But yeah, I think Stoops, he deserves at least another year, and see what happens. If, as you said, if they get 5, 6 wins, then maybe some of the, as you said, those 50-50 games, figure out a way to flip them back the other way, and then maybe get this thing rolling again. But it's I'm excited about the season, and we'll that uncertainty, it could be good, it could be bad. We'll just have to wait and see.